Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my book review of the book Foundation by Isaac Asimov. This is a science fiction book. It was written in the 1940s and published in parts, and then it was released as a full novel in 1951, I believe. And this is a very classic sci-fi book, very old, very much. Everyone's going to make this pun, but I'm going to have to do it anyway. It's a foundational book for the science fiction genre, and when I was reading it, I was like, oh, I can totally see it. I can totally see it. There are things in this book that I think some people will absolutely love and latch onto. And there are things in this book that a lot of people will absolutely hate and not be able to get over. And I feel kind of in the middle, where rather than feel meh about the book, I have things that I love and things about that I hate about the book. So I have two opposite feelings with this book. And so because of that, it's very difficult to rate, but I still have a rating for it. So let me talk about first what I liked. What I liked about this book is the themes. This is a very layered book with lots of excellent themes. There are themes about how a society can prevent warfare and can actually succeed against enemies without using war. This includes things like utilizing your religion properly. This includes using your economy properly, using public opinion, using culture, using other things outside of the military to get what you need, to get you to a better bargaining position, to get you to the point where your enemies don't want to attack you anymore. Make yourself vitally important to them, that if they were to attack you and you cut off trade, they would no longer want to fight you. Things like that. Some of those concepts are very much either Machiavellian, or if you want a more modern day example, like Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, like those types of things are very common throughout this book, and I love exploring those deep themes about how to have good strategy without resulting in bloodshed, and I think those are just very fascinating. There's also excellent themes about the importance of the sciences. They talk about how the importance of hard sciences to society, but also the soft sciences. There is this group that just wants to build encyclopedias, and they're just going to be writing encyclopedias for decades and decades and even centuries. And you're like, well, is it really that important? Do you need that much information? The answer is yes, because of the important role it can play in society. And they're building this up because they know something's going to happen, and they're going to need those encyclopedias in the future. And this book talks about the importance of information and curating information and protecting information, and also about making sure that you're in a place where you could gather information. If you're going to be put into a situation that you might need to remember later, maybe you should have recording devices, maybe you should document everything that you did that day. It just talks about the idea of preserving all information that's possible. And so those themes were also good. There's also the theme that was probably the strongest theme, which was the theme of preparing yourself for the future. A lot of times we think in the next year in our preparations, or the next 5 years. People talk about 5-year plans, or even governments might talk about 10-year plans. You know, we had the 10-year plan. All right, we're going to have, starting in 1961, by 1969, we're going to have a man on the moon. So it's less than 10 years. The idea was we are going to continue to try to do things in the future. Well, this book talks about preparing even further in the future, not just 1 year or 5 years or 10 years, but 300 years, but 1,000 years, but 100,000 years, prepping for the future, a future you won't see and your direct descendants may not see, but society will see. And I think a lot of people will be tempted to only look at this from a global warming perspective of, oh, well, you need to think about the future because of how it affects the planet. And I could see how you'd think that. I think that this can be applied in many other ways. For instance, a country's financial position. Yes, we might be thriving right now, but how will this affect us in the next 100 years? Yes, we might be in an economic downfall right now. Yes, we don't have money to spend, but maybe that'll help us in the future. You have to think about things long term, and this book explores those themes really well. I also liked that this book had a lot of world building that is so obviously influenced other sci-fi creators. For example, First I should say this is a very soft sci-fi. There's no action in this book. There's no real like action scenes. It's all like characters talking, which I do like in my books. But it's mostly the world building is very minimal. Like they'll describe, oh, this planet is just an entire city, but it doesn't actually like go into the details of what that city's like. It's not getting into the nitty gritty. It's very much surface level world building. But this is one of the original concepts. Like, yes, I know the idea of an how do you say that word? Ecumenopolis. Ecumenopolis. An ecumenopolis has been in society since the time of the Greeks, but in real like modern sci-fi terms, this was really where it came in. And he just like basically explains that there's an ecumenopolis, and then that's it. He doesn't really go further into it. And that obviously was picked up by George Lucas for Star Wars for the idea of Coruscant. There's also the characters from Corel, known as the Corellians, spelled with a K. In Star Wars, there's Corellia with the Corellians. So obviously, George Lucas had to have read this book. I'm certain he's at least read it once sometime in his youth. That's somehow in the back of his mind. Maybe he didn't realize he was stealing these ideas, but hey, good minds borrow from other writers. Great minds steal from them outright. But he obviously was influenced by the world building here. Also, there were some of the technologies, particularly around the technologies. I believe it was like part 4, where they were talking about the traders and how they could make one thing out of another thing, like the way that transmutation and things like that. That kind of reminded me of some of the world building used in Star Trek. So it made me wonder if Gene Roddenberry also read this book, because this is a classic science fiction novel. It really sold well, and it's really well known amongst sci-fi audiences. But let's get into the things I really didn't like about this book. I would almost say I hate this about the book. This book is split up into 5 parts, and each part pretty much stands alone except for the fact that it takes place like 50 years or 30 years after the previous part. This sometimes works in some books when you have big time jumps like this because you're following the same characters. This is why House of the Dragon worked so well. Yes, there were big time jumps throughout, but they weren't huge. It's not like we went 50 years. We only advanced like 10 years here. But all of the characters that we follow in the time jumps are still the same characters. Here, all of the characters are different. There's one character, Hari Seldon, who created the foundation, the concept, and created the plan. And he's referenced throughout, and his influence is felt throughout. But there's no actual characters that are in each part. Each part, it's like very much self-contained. Like when I mentioned that this book was written in parts, it's almost as if it's a short story here, it's part 1, and then a short story, and then a short story, and then he just linked them all together to put them into one published novel. And for some books, there are short stories basically that work to be a novel, but it just doesn't feel like a novel. There's no character development of any characters at all in this book. There are characters that like you find out how bad they are, how good they are, maybe, but there's not like development of a character being one thing and becoming another and changing their minds and attitudes. Pretty much all the characters from when they are introduced are pretty much the same, except for a few villains. And so there's not a character work. You don't really get to spend too much time. You spend 40, 50 pages with the characters, and then, nope, we're done. And so you don't get attached to anyone in this book. I think Hari Seldon, because he's like mentioned throughout, but he only has actual page time for a few pages in this book. So there's just, it's very difficult to connect with a book when you can't connect with its characters. Themes are great. And like a good concept and world building is great, but if you don't have good characters, it's hard for me to personally connect with your story. Second of all, another thing I really didn't like about this book is how flat it felt throughout. Like, it felt like the characters were just plucked in. The traders were very much traders, and the priest people were priest people, and except for villains, they all pretty much stayed in their lanes. And when a character went to go do politics, it's like they left behind the other part of their lives. And so it just didn't feel as nuanced in that aspect. But it really comes down to characters. I didn't like the characters because I couldn't connect with them. And I also didn't like how short the parts were because you didn't have enough time, and also because they felt choppy. You'd get right in, the story was just getting good, and now's when you cut it off. Like, each part, in my opinion, each part should have been its own full-length 300-page novel. And we should have spent a lot of time, and now this would have turned this from like a 7-book series as it is now, he may have had to make it like a 20 or 30 or 40-book series, but I think it would have been much more valuable than just doing a little short stories that all interspersed. So I really didn't like those aspects of it, but again, the themes in this book and some of the world building are incredible. And the foundational aspect, like the classic nature of this book, is really valuable to society. Like, I'm glad I read it. And I think it's important that sci-fi readers read this to try to understand how science fiction worked back then and how it influenced today and things like that. But it's not like a pentultimate. I don't hold this up and say, oh man, this is just an amazing novel. Now, I think one day I'll read the later books. I think it would be fun. And if the other books don't jump around as much, if the other books are more like solid novels, I might actually really get into this series, because I'm telling you, the themes are fantastic. But I don't know. I haven't looked into that yet. And I don't know if this will become a favorite series, but as it stands right now, this is not like a book that I'm like, you need to read this book, you need to read this book. Like Dune is like a single novel that started a series. Like, that's like a novel I can say, yes, that's a classic sci-fi book that's classic for a reason, and you need to go read it right now. I'm like, this is classic for a reason, and if you're really a big sci-fi fan, but if you're just kind of generally sci-fi, there's other things you could read, and there's better uses of your time. So that's my nuanced look at the idea of Foundation. I'd give it a 6.5 out of 10. It's valuable. I enjoy reading it, kind of, but it's not a stellar book that just blew me away or made me like rush out to read more. So that's my thoughts on Foundation. If you've read this book, what did you think of it? Leave your comments down below. What other sci-fi books like this do you think are like foundational books that sci-fi fans need to read? Let me know those thoughts in the comments section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.